Today, I am unveiling our platform and our approach to addressing racism in the city of Chicago and desegregating our city. If you ask the average person or even the not so average person, even many astute observers, what are the major problems in Chicago politics and Chicago government, they might list off problems with our school system. They might say lack of development in education. They might say lack of economic development. They might say environmental pollution, particularly if you live on the southeast side. They might talk about policing. But each one of those problems is a symptom of two major problems in this city. Two sides of one coin that contains the two major illnesses that cause every one of the other problems in our city. And those problems are political corruption and racism. Political corruption being based in the fact that we have an economy that funnels most of our wealth to just a few people, a handful of people, and those people then use that wealth to corrupt our government and make it difficult for us to make the changes that we need in every single area of operations of this city. And the other side, of course, is racism. Because after that political corruption, the people who tend to suffer the most tend to be people of color. I think that any candidate who tells you that they're going to solve any of these problems but does not deal directly with political corruption and racism is pulling your leg. You cannot deal with the problems in education, where many of our public school dollars are being funneled to the corporate donors of our mayor. And the schools that suffer the most from the lack of resources that result from that end up being black and brown schools. You can't tell me you're going to deal with that without addressing corruption and racism. You can't tell me you're going to deal with environmental pollution, where companies who make political donations get to pollute as much as they want, and the communities that get the brunt and suffer the most from that tend to be black or brown communities. You can't tell me you're going to deal with that without directly dealing with political corruption and racism. Policing. Do I have to explain it? Political corruption and racism. And so my campaign intends to deal directly with both of these forces that are causing most of the ills that our city suffers from. I've often voiced some of the central tenets to my approach to corruption in terms of not accepting money from big corporations or any businesses that want to do business with the city on the city level and get citywide contracts. We do not take those kinds of donations. I've also talked about corruption in relationship to the need for public financing of elections. And we're going to unveil a more detailed platform on corruption on a later date. But today I want to deal with the tail side of that two-sided coin. The head side being corruption and the tail side being racism and segregation. Racism and segregation have a purpose. Racism is a tool of the rich and powerful to keep working people divided against one another so that each group can be exploited at one level or another. The first step in racism is to malign one group of working people in the minds of another group. In America, for instance, that's always meant maligning the character of working people of color to create disdain and distrust in the eyes of working white people. In short, it meant fostering and spreading prejudice and bias toward people of color, and toward black people in particular. Segregation, then, is designed to keep those groups of working people apart, so that the false negative ideas that you've given them about each other will be rarely challenged by real experiences with the people they've been conditioned to despise and distrust. Once the bias and segregation have taken hold, it makes all working people, all of us, easier targets for economic exploitation and political suppression. This level of manipulative control and exploitation are the ultimate goals of racism. So they use bias to create a mental barrier between working people, and segregation to create a physical barrier between those same working people. Together, those mental and physical barriers make it easy to target people, and people of color in particular, for exploitation. That is how racism works in America. And few city governments have followed that pattern of bias, segregation, and exploitation as relentlessly and brutally as our own City Hall. From the mayor's office and the city council to the police department and the school board. Much of Chicago's history has been about our politicians serving the interests of the rich and powerful by maintaining racial barriers amongst working people. The Chicago Real Estate Board, for example, led the charge toward racial covenants in housing contracts in the early part of the 20th century. The fight for the Federal Community Reinvestment Act began in Chicago because of the practice of redlining by Chicago banks. These structural barriers were reinforced by public policy decisions explicitly designed to maintain racial boundaries and barriers. Urban renewal projects like the Dan Ryan Expressway were geographically positioned to create physical barriers to segregate black working people from white working people. Few practices demonstrate how the rich and powerful use racism to exploit white and black working people more than the practice of contract selling and the manufactured race-based real estate panic and redlining that made contract selling possible. Banks and real estate speculators use fears and false prejudices against black people to get white people to sell their homes for far less than they were worth, and then sold those homes to black people for far more than they were worth. The rich and powerful don't give a damn about working black people, and they don't give a damn about the well-being of working white people. They use racism to exploit both groups. However, their policies concentrated poverty in black communities, and we see the consequences of this today. One result of all of those practices is the loss of massive amounts of home equity related wealth for black families and their descendants across Chicago. In 1966, Dr. Martin Luther King moved with his family to the West Side and organized an open housing campaign, the Chicago Freedom Movement. Despite his efforts and an agreement on fair housing with then Mayor Richard J. Daley, that promise was never fulfilled under that agreement. Today, we continue to see policies that segregate us from each other and exploit communities of color. Under the current administration, Chicago public schools are the most understaffed in the state, and those serving minority neighborhoods are even more understaffed, set up to fail, and shut down. Economic development plans are focused on gentrifying neighborhoods and on traditionally white areas of the north side. Investments happen downtown and along the lake, while struggling communities of color see their services cut. From schools and mental health clinics to library hours and community liaison positions and programs. Policing strategies are designed to further oppress and exploit communities of color. While City Hall's participation in the larger national war on poor black people, euphemistically referred to as the war on drugs, has created an entire generation of African American men who have prison records for nonviolent offenses. I was at a United Working Families event, and in their platform they had this key component, this tenet where they said, we want elected officials who will call out the brutalities of our current system. And the so-called war on drugs is one of those brutalities. And we need elected officials who will call it what it is. It is a war on poor, working black people and people of color in general. And to the extent that Chicago and its police force participates in that so-called war on drugs, it is participating in the national war against poor people of color and black people in particular. And as mayor, I will be pulling us out of that war. As a result of all of these prejudices and acts of racism, Chicago has seen reverse migration of African American working people, poor and middle class, who are leaving the city for the suburbs or other cities where they can find opportunities that have been stolen from them by the rich, the powerful, and the corrupt, incompetent politicians who serve them. That is part of the history of Chicago. But that doesn't have to be our future. There's another story. There's another history. A history where the first non-indigenous settler of Chicago was a black man. A history where the Chicago's wigwam was the site of the political convention that nominated Abraham Lincoln for president, leading to the emancipation of millions of enslaved men and women. A history where a young white woman named Kayla Ravier was forced to leave the North Side in 1962 because of the color of her firstborn son, but whose third son was brought back to the North Side by an all-white local school council 50 years later and given the responsibility of leading and safeguarding the education and safety of their children, the most important responsibility you can give someone. That is the story of Chicago. That is the story of my family's life. You can't live that life and be cynical about the hopes and possibilities of this city. All we need is ensure that we have leadership. We have the leadership capacity in our politicians that matches the potential of our people. And we don't have that right now. We don't have leadership capacity within our politicians that matches the potential of our people. We want more, we can do more, but we don't have politicians who will exercise the leadership to lead us forward toward the future we want. That is going to change in my administration. Toward that end, we must elect men and women to public office who are committed to enacting policies that will reverse the structural and cultural barriers enacted by Chicago politicians to promote and reinforce a sad pattern of racism and segregation in our city. My administration's goals are to diminish and conquer our prejudices and racial biases, end segregation and build bridges between working families, and end the economic exploitation of communities of colors and invest equitably in those communities. What follows are some specific ideas for reaching those goals. I want to be clear that we will get significant community input for the execution of these strategies, as well as input on additional strategies to achieve these same goals. So I'll read just a few policy proposals, and I'll try and close and take questions. Toward the goal of diminishing and conquering our prejudices and racial biases. If the foundation of racism is racial prejudice, what is today called implicit bias, that's the foundation of racism, prejudice. All of us hold these prejudices and biases to one extent or another. Millions of otherwise good and well-being people can be biased and are indeed biased as a result of a continuing effort to associate communities of color with criminality, dishonesty, and many other negative characterizations of our fellow human beings. We've been exposed to it all our lives. I heard a story of a man telling his daughter, it was on the NPR program Invisibilia, about the fact he has a white man with a black daughter. And he gets to this point where he knows he has to tell her about the world she's going to face after the Michael Brown incident in St. Louis. And so he tells her, people are going to make judgments about you based on the color of your skin. It's not fair, but that's just the world we live in. And I have to prepare you for that. Less than a week later, he found himself on a street corner at night, leaving the gym near his job, and he sees a black man walking down the street. And he tells himself, let me just stop here. The guy looked a little suspicious to him. I'm going to stop and there's a white woman on the bus stop, on a bench, and the black man's walking toward her. So I'm going to stop here just in case. Just in case. And as the guy comes into view, he sees this little happy black boy walking behind the man. He remembers the jump in that little black boy's step, and he goes, it's just a dad out with his son. He's just a dad like me. And all of a sudden he felt disgusted in himself because he had just done to that man what he had told his black daughter people were going to do to him. And what we have to do is create a city where we all come face to face with our biases and prejudice in a manner as brave as that man came face to face with his and committed himself to addressing them. But we have to have leadership that will promote that kind of self-reflection across this city. We don't have that right now. With that in mind, a vote for me as mayor means that you are committed to creating a city government that goes beyond an occasional anti-bias training, but is committed to building a comprehensive, ongoing anti-bias culture in every city department. Toward the goal of ending segregation and building bridges between working families, we have a thing that we call United Chicago, where we're going to get groups actively involved in all 77 communities toward building this community of equity. In some white communities, it might look like, how are we going to integrate? In the black community, it's like, how are we going to use the resources of the city to build up our community and make it a place people want to come to? But people are going to be actively involved in this. And so United Chicago groups in middle to high income neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly white will develop equity plans to open up housing opportunities for underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, including middle and low income families. These groups will get the support for building an anti-bias culture in their neighborhood so that legitimate concerns about specific negative neighborhood behaviors can be articulated and addressed without racially biased assumptions regarding all future residents. We're going to provide information and housing opportunities to potential home buyers or renters in neighborhoods throughout Chicago. A more effective use of housing vouchers that includes professional support and using federal monies to assist with down payments, which are often an impediment to people moving into higher income neighborhoods and renting in them. We're going to eliminate discriminatory real estate practices. We're going to have support for projects that would add affordable housing units to communities that have historically had opportunity and investment, but not integration. We want to partner majority black and Latino schools with majority white schools for shared space. This incident with Dunbar and NTA comes to mind. You have Dunbar, and you have this predominantly white community or affluent community in the South Loop. And instead of trying to make Dunbar a place that's attractive to all of the families in the South Loop, exercising some leadership, maybe holding some opening houses, and as mayor invite people from both communities to come out and build bridges between those communities and invest in that school to create an opportunity for real, meaningful integration. You want to shut down the majority black school and give it to the majority white residents of South Loop. Like, no leadership whatsoever. We want to end economic exploitation and invest equitably in communities. And toward that end, our last end, we will consistently name the existing brutalities of racism and segregation wherever we see them, in order to keep the need for an integrated, bias-free city at the forefront of public consciousness. And we will propose bold, far-reaching remedies for those brutalities. For low-income neighborhoods of color, the United Chicago Compact will focus on economic development, infrastructure improvements, and better services that will enhance the lives of current residents and make their neighborhoods an attractive options for those who are not residents but might move in. Strong measures will be taken to prevent gentrification from displacing current residents. And of course, we want to make our neighborhood schools the best schools in this city. And that's not hard to do. All we have to do is invest. And we already have the best teaching staff. We just need to give them the resources they need. We want TIF reform. And we certainly want to use those dollars from TIFs to create equity. Use them equitably. We need equity in this city. We don't have it. Equity is not we spend equally with everyone. It's we spend the most and invest the most in places that need the most. Right now what this city does is the exact opposite. We invest the most in those who need the least, and we invest the least in those who need the most. That's going to change under my administration. We're also going to support the redevelopment of neighborhood commercial districts. We're going to connect neighborhoods of color to jobs and build housing equity and wealth in communities that have historically been denied that opportunity. Enact rent stabilization and push for that change at the state level so that we can do it at the local level. Invest in professional and effective public safety programs and personnel. We need to rethink how public safety is planned and organized. We currently focus on the numbers of arrests made and tickets issued. Instead, we should be measuring and rewarding the number of relationships that police officers build in the community and other public safety personnel build in the community. These relationships will allow us to know which youth need extra support and guidance. And they'll build trust within the community. And they'll provide local information that can be used to solve crimes when they actually happen. Lastly, we will institute a regular equity analysis for all new projects that this city engages in and evaluate existing projects on the same criteria used in the equity analysis. And we're going to do more than just prevent negative impacts on people of color. One of the requirements is that these programs have to have a positive impact and reverse the inequities that our communities suffer from today. I conclude by saying that we must remember that racism consists of one, biases against people of color that create mental barriers between them and other working people. Number two, segregation that creates physical barriers between those same working people. And three, the oppression, political oppression and economic exploitation of all working people, and people of color in particular. Since this is what racism is, then any plan to end racism as we know it must do three things. It must confront and diminish the biases on which racism is based. It must dismantle segregation and build bridges between different working communities of color and white working communities. And it must end all exploitative practices while making significant investments in communities that have been most impacted by the exploitation. We must become a city of equity. In this election, a vote for me, a vote for Troy LaRaviere, will be a vote to fundamentally transform our reality and create that city. Thank you. Any questions?
I didn't hear you say anything about ageism.
I didn't say anything about Islamophobia either, or anti-immigration. But those are certainly central tenets. When I said divide working people against, it's dividing straight working people against gay working people, dividing Christian working people against Muslim working people, dividing retired and of age working people against the youth. Right? Any of those mechanisms to divide and conquer working people will be enemies of this administration. And we will take active, consistent, deliberate measures to counter them. So good question. I'm glad you mentioned that. That was actually, I skipped a lot in here because it's a pretty long list of recommendations. But one of the recommendations actually mentioned that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You mentioned pulling the city out of the, for lack of a better word, the so-called war on drugs.
The war on black people. The war on poor black people and working people in particular.
That campaign in
communities
particular.
of color.
So can you elaborate more on what specific direction you'd give the Chicago Police Department to pull the city out of that?
Specific direction?
How are you going to be pulling out
So
of that?
we have to look at offenses take a careful, thoughtful look at the offenses that people are being arrested for. Offenses that actually create unsafe communities and offenses that don't. Right? And carefully and methodically pull out of the efforts to either enforce certain laws against certain drugs or change the way we enforce them. Perhaps for certain people, we don't necessarily want to arrest them. We want to target them towards treatment and rehabilitation services rather than prison time or jail time or time in the county. But it has to be very thoughtful and deliberate. Like, which of these offenses actually deserve prison times and which of these offenses call more for treatment than incarceration? And I would imagine that we would find most of them call for treatment, incarceration. Oh, and possibly this person needs a job. You know, I don't know anybody who actually wants to be out there, you know, being involved in the drug trade. People want to work. And so we can divert people towards treatment. We can divert people towards job placement. We can divert people towards schooling. But anything that we can do to reduce the number of people that we're sending to jail or to prison, that's what I mean when I talk about pulling us out of this war on drugs. Does that answer your question?
It helps. Do you have any specific offenses in mind?
I mean, marijuana possession, for example.
Could be more,
Right.
you target more treatment?
Absolutely. Well, that's, I mean, for some marijuana possession, I don't even know if there's a need for treatment. Right? Just leave them alone. Let them do what they're going to do. I mean, I don't know if I'd arrest an alcoholic. Right? I don't know if I would target anybody drinking alcohol for treatment. Now, if they have an alcohol problem, then we target them for treatment. If they're drinking a glass of beer, you leave them the hell alone. There's no evidence that says that we should be arresting people who smoke marijuana. None whatsoever, any more than there's evidence that says we should be arresting people who drink a beer. So why are we doing it? And so to the extent that there's evidence that there is a need for treatment, real evidence, then that's the direction we'll head in. To the extent that there's no evidence that there should be intervention whatsoever, then we have no intervention whatsoever. To the extent that there's evidence that this is harming the community and there needs to be some kind of consequence for this, then there's a consequence. And even when we get to consequences, prison time isn't necessarily the option. We have to have restorative justice programs. They have been shown to have much more of a positive impact on changing the behavior of people who engage in behaviors that harm their community than prison time does. And so anything that we can do to reduce the number of young men of color, Black and Latino in particular, who are going to prison or going to jail or being arrested and getting these records, we're going to do it. It's a good question. Thank you.
A couple of days ago, Trump brought up stop and frisk in Chicago. What is your opinion about that?
So I'm an evidence-based person, and what the evidence says is that it creates distrust. I think that the stat was that for people who have been stopped and frisked, if they are ever the victim of a crime or witness a crime, if they have experienced stop and frisk, they are 60% less likely to contact law enforcement after being a victim of that crime, because you have completely created complete distrust of them and the police department. Right? And besides that, it's been shown not to turn up much. You know? And it's also been shown that when people are stopped and frisked, people are searched for weapons, the people most likely to have a weapon on them, guess what? White people. The people more likely to get stopped and frisked, do you have to guess? We all know, Black people. And so for many of those reasons, or all of those reasons, I completely oppose, not surprisingly, any effort toward pushing Chicago police towards stop and frisk, because one, we know who they're going to target. They're going to create distrust. Two, you create greater incidents and likelihood of some kind of police-involved brutality as a result of that stop and frisk, as we saw with Harith Augustus in the case where he was actually killed. Three, it does nothing to improve public safety. We need police to actually be out investigating real crime. Okay? Our clearance rate is less than 20%, and clearance just means they've identified a suspect. It doesn't mean they've actually caught the person who did it. the number of people who actually go to prison for murder is less than 5%. And with the number of people who are now being exonerated after being falsely convicted, we have to wonder how much of that 5% is even the people who did it. We have to improve the investigative capacity of our police force to solve actual crimes, not going around guessing at who might be committing one or who might have a gun to commit a future one. They're ones that have already been committed. The evidence is out there, but you have absolutely no training or capacity whatsoever to get out there, find it, and apprehend the people who committed them. Like even with restorative justice, you can't put people in restorative justice programs unless you catch them. And we don't have the investigative capacity to even do that. Not only with murders, we had the 76 shootings, 12 murders, $1.5 billion police budget, 0 arrests. Take a look at that and then go up on the north side where I talked to an owner of a luxury goods store. She sells luxury goods, white woman. And she told me a store got broken into. It made the front page of both newspapers. And the police didn't visit her store twice. They came once, that was it. She even called them because she found something she thought might have a fingerprint on it. Nothing. And then when she talked to an officer she knew but who was not related to the investigation, he said, "You should be lucky nobody was hurt." They're never going to solve that. So whether it's murders on the south side or a burglary on the north side, we don't have the investigative capacity to solve crime. We just want to keep throwing more bodies out there, thinking somehow that's going to prevent crime. And so we'll have an entirely different strategy under my administration, and stop and frisk will not be part of that strategy. Thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have policies and programs that you're proposing to keep residents in their neighborhoods as neighborhoods gentrify or become, as rents go up and so on?
So I certainly support an end to the state ban on rent control, and really rent control isn't what people are talking about. They're talking about rent stabilization. I don't know of anyone talking about actual strict rent control as it exists in New York, but rent stabilization is what most people want. They want basically a program that keeps the rising of rents on par with the rising rate of inflation. And so I certainly support that. I support using the CHA for what it's supposed to be used for. What is it, about $500 million that they just weren't spending because they're gold. I mean, we've been set up to fail. Our schools are we're set up to fail in education, we're set up to fail in housing, we're set up to fail in economic development. Right? The agency exists. They had $500 million and just sat on it. And so I certainly support using those monies to increase existing public housing, restore public housing that people have moved out of, but then they just let sit, and then help people to afford to live, using that money to help people afford to live in their homes. And I think one thing that's not mentioned in relationship to housing, but extremely important, affordable housing, the key word there is affordable. Right? People don't have enough money, and so the vouchers come in relationship to supplementing people's incomes. But the other thing that never gets mentioned is raising the minimum wage. Right? If you make more money, then rent all of a sudden becomes affordable. And so those are just a few things. But the other thing I'd like to say is that we want to partner with organizations across this city who've been dealing with these problems far longer than anyone else. That's where the expertise is, in this city. It's right here in Chicago. And so from the Logan Square Neighborhood Association to the Community Renewal Society to the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, the ideas and programs are there. Even most of the stuff I just said were not my ideas, the things I learned from organizations like that. And we have to stay in contact and build relationships with organizations like that to build out our platform and the agenda for our city in relationship to housing, education, economic development, you name it. What I don't know, you know. I'm not going to solve Chicago's problems. We're going to solve Chicago's problems. Thanks for the question. All right. Thank you all for coming.